All right, so once again, a very good afternoon to you all and a warm welcome as we convene this high-level policy forum. So as already indicated in our communication, this is a joint event that we are co-organizing with our partners and Namibia and the Embassy of Switzerland in Addis Ababa. Thanks to both for joining us in the convening of this important event today. So I think, as we can all agree, in the context of this emerging and also very timely discourse on the potential for a reform or a transformation of the multilateral system, I think it is pretty much apparent that now, more than ever, is the time to discuss these possibilities and potentials for an African multilateral foreign policy. So even having a specific regard, to AU's recent admission to the G20, and then also this building momentum that we are observing for the reform of key international and global organizations, specifically the UN Security Council, but also this building possibility for the reform of the international financial architecture. It becomes really essential to have the need for an African and even specifically for an AU unified policy position becomes really essential to sort of foster a very precise but also a consistent sort of external agency for the AU and Africa, both on issues that are specifically of relevance to Africa, but also with regards to matters of wider global relevance. So it is really within this background, in this context, that today's high-level policy forum brings together this panel to afford a platform for sort of reflecting on possibilities and also the potential for achieving an AU or an African common policy, common multilateral foreign policy. So having said that and having set the stage, let me just introduce our esteemed panel. We have with us His Excellency Ambassador Petro Mona, who's the representative of Switzerland to the AU, IGAD, and UNECA, who will be delivering opening remarks. Then we also have Mr. Rudney, who is the Deputy Permanent Representative of Namibia to AU and UNECA. Then we also have Ambassador Dr. Takada Alamu, who is the former State Minister of Ethiopia and the permanent representative to the UN Security Council. Then last but not least, we have with us Dr. Oli, who's a research and training fellow in international relations and security at the University of Geneva. So I welcome each and every one of you and thank you for joining us during this high-level policy forum. I will myself be moderating this event. I am Sion Hagos, a senior researcher at Amani, Africa. So thank you. Let me hand over to His Excellency Ambassador Petro to do the opening remarks. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sion. Ambassadors, Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends, let me also join our colleagues from Amani, Africa, in welcoming you very warmly to this high-level discussion entitled Towards a Multilateral African Foreign Policy, Africa's evolving role in global governance and its implication at the UN and the African Union. And I would actually start by maybe trying to answer the question that might linger in this room is, why is Switzerland co-hosting an event on Africa's foreign policy? It is neither our place and certainly not our intention to submit any recommendations to something that has to and has been and has to continue to be an inner African discussion. It is up to the member states and the African Union to define the ways on how they would like to shape the future of Africa's foreign policy. So our interest actually lies rather in the second part of the title of today's event, about the implication this has and will continue to have on the United Nations. This is where our vested interest lies. And this is rooted in the belief that if we continue to aspire towards a more just, a more inclusive, a more accountable, a more effective multilateral system, then we need to have a strong African voice in the midst of it. And as Switzerland, we do subscribe to this ambition and to this aspiration. I think we have seen, we continue to see how our multilateral system, anchored in the UN Charter, which is still, I believe, one of the most visionary documents that was created a little over 70 years ago, has been violated, has been breached, has been strained, and has driven us into a polarized world with a lack of trust, a lack of solidarity, and a lack of universality. And these three notions, I haven't invented them. You will find them, among others, also in the new Agenda for Peace of the UN Secretary General, and I will come back to that. But we have seen it day in, day out, how the multilateral system has not necessarily delivered what our aspirations are. We've seen the breach of the UN Charter by one of the permanent members of the Security Council. We've heard at the summit in New York how we are lagging behind in the fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goals. We are struggling as an international community to find more immediate and tangible answers to climate change. We see human rights violations in all four corners of the world, and the list could go on and on. So the point I'm trying to make is that our ambition is to live up to what has anchored in the UN Charter, but to reinvigorate this ambition to have a better multilateral system for all of us, for all the people, ultimately. And this also brings us back again to the UN Charter. It's we, the people, that anchors the multilateral system. Now, when it comes to the relations between Africa and the UN, we've just had a very interesting, a very engaged example just last week when the UN Security Council was hosted by the African Union Peace and Security Council here in Addis for the annual consultations. And I think it was important to participate in deliberations to really also understand how the two systems can work together, how they aspire to common goals, how also, and this was included in the communiqué, on issues both thematically and geographically, we have to find better solutions for the people on the ground. But there the risk as well lies in the lack of trust. And I think this is where all of us have an interest in moving forward, in grabbing the opportunities that lie on the table to build on a dialogue of trust and solidarity. Let me give you one concrete example. Currently, as you know, the UN Security Council and the AU Peace and Security Council are also discussing on UN-assessed contributions for AU-led peace support operations. And I see Britannia here, and I would like to quote her because she was actually briefing the UN Security Council in May under the Swiss presidency on exactly this topic. And one key phrase stood out for me, that she mentioned provocatively when it was about funding. She provocatively mentioned it's not about money. And this puts a bit more stress on me having you here in the room, Britannia. But for me, that was critical to understand that this discussion about EU-led peace support operations should not primarily be about money. It should be an opportunity to rethink the global security and peace architecture. It should be an opportunity for articulating new ways forward in not only finding ways to what we have to do, and that is to rethink peacekeeping and moving towards, where necessary, peace enforcement, but also to use this possibility also to think about preventive measures, about sustaining peace, about how we articulate the relations between the two councils. Because if we move towards a situation where the AU Peace and Security Council, for good reasons, might decide on the need for have a peace enforcement operations on the ground in Africa, and they will send the documentation to New York simply with the request, please fund, this will not lead us towards trust. This will lead us towards tensions. This will lead us towards a misunderstanding of what we're actually here to discuss. And so I think the discussion that has not started today and will certainly continue also after today about Africa's future foreign policy is absolutely critical, not just for Africa itself, but really for our understanding on how we move forward with a better, more just, more inclusive, more effective global multilateral system. And this is why we are absolutely thrilled that we were able to join forces together with our friends from Namibia and Amani Africa in organizing this high-level panel. And I'm very much looking forward to an engaged discussion also with all of you here in the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Petro, for that brief encapsulating of what this policy forum discussion is all about. I specifically found it very interesting that you emphasized that an African foreign policy on multilateralism is not necessarily just about Africa, but that it actually has a greater impact on global affairs more generally. I think this is something that we can delve into further as we go on to these discussions. Let me hand over to Rodney, DPR from Namibia, for welcoming remarks.
Thank you, moderator. Thank you, Ambassador, for the remarks. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Let me take this moment to thank the Embassy of Switzerland and Amani Africa for partnering on this pertinent issue of multilateralism. Namibia has been working closely with Dr. Solomon Deso and his Amani Africa team since the AU Summit in February 2023 on understanding and consolidating an African voice on multilateralism and the reform of the international system. We therefore thank all of you for coming to this event. Ladies and gentlemen, Honorable Netumbo Nandi Ndaitwah, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of Namibia, has been championing a process Namibia is co-chairing with Amani Africa on galvanizing an African voice on the reform of multilateralism. At our Namibia Amani Africa joint high-level side event on the margins of the recently concluded 78th session of the UN General Assembly, Honorable Ndaitwah once again reiterated Namibia's position, which is widely held, that the current system is outdated and does not reflect the realities of the 21st century. And I believe that is something we should really ponder on. Africa today has more than 1.3 billion inhabitants, the majority of whom are young people, and the continent is experiencing rapid growth. However, Africa is still underrepresented in major international institutions, such as United Nations Security Council, the international financial institutions. This means that Africa has less say in decisions that affect its future. In particular, Namibia has taken the opportunity to amplify the common African position as exposed in the Elusini Consensus and Swiss Declaration and championed by the C10 on the reform of the United Nations Security Council. This issue is one issue that Namibia has been advocating on, which is not representative, equitable, and fairly composed, despite being entrusted to maintain international peace and security. Another area of interest to Namibia, and indeed the rest of Africa, is the reform of international financial institutions. Here we see that Africa is used as a source of raw natural resources. However, when comes time to finance our own ownership and development of these resources, to further our economic prosperity, obscure and unfair lending practices with a focus on austerity are used disproportionately towards Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, Namibia is currently co-chairing the Summit of the Futures process at the United Nations General Assembly. Africa needs to continue ensuring its voice is heard in this process. We can use our membership to other organizations such as G77, which is currently chaired by Uganda, to get wider international support. Honorable Nadine Daitwa has particularly called on African member states engaging in such processes to use think tanks such as Amani Africa to generate ideas and proposals to solve some of these persistent injustices. We therefore look forward to this engagement with all of you. And once again, we thank the Embassy of Switzerland and Amani Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rodney, for that intervention, specifically for emphasizing that we have a system which is apparently outdated and that we need to look into our current realities in adopting a new kind of global system that can address our current issues. So I will hand over to Dr. Takada Alamu, who can also share with us some perspectives on the basis of the previous membership of Ethiopia in the UN Security Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Sion, our moderator. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, I see many friends in the crowd. What I wanted to address in this presentation is the prospects and challenges for multilateral African foreign policy. Before I do so, I want to say how pleased I am to take part in this very important conversation for obvious reasons. Africa's role, not only within the continent, but also at the global level, is indeed becoming very critical. I don't think this demands a lot of explanation, given the nature of the global situation at the present time, which continues to be very, very complex. The input of Africa is going to be very critical, really. And this has to be discharged with a lot of responsibility on the part of our continent, no doubt. Humility and realism obliges us, nonetheless, that when we refer to Africa's role at the global level, we should never be oblivious to Africa's limitations, which are indeed huge. What I meant was, given the event and the growing divergence among countries, most particularly between those that have so much power. As I said, what I meant was, given the ever-growing deep divergence among countries, most particularly between those that have so much power at their disposal, the voice of Africa if exercised wisely and carefully, would indeed have weight, and thus could be used beneficially, both in the interest of Africa and the global community. In fact, at present, there is much additional reason for Africa to be able to use opportunities it has with wisdom and farsightedness, which in the first place demands commitment to a common agenda and to building consensus. The invitation by the G20 for the African Union to join the group is such an opportunity. It's also for this reason that I am so much appreciative of the joint organizers of this event, namely Namibia, Switzerland, and Amani, Africa. It's my great hope that we should have useful, productive conversation at this event. In this connection, what I intend to do is focus not on matters that are within the purview of the G20, but on matters that are within the domain of my professional experience in connection with the Security Council and the role of African representatives in the Council. Africa has felt for some time that it is dismally represented on the Security Council. All the more so in light of the fact that African conflict situations usually overcrowd Security Council agenda. It has been for this reason that Africa has been an active and enthusiastic participant in the debate on the reform of the Security Council, focusing on equitable representation on and increasing the membership of the Council. As is widely recognized, Africa's demand, which is expressed in the Izuluwi consensus, is for 2 permanent and 2 additional non-permanent seats. The effort of reforming the Security Council is a daunting task, which has been going on for the last 15 years. Though member states are never fully transparent regarding their position on the matter, this is particularly true with respect to the permanent members of the Council. It's very easy to surmise that none of the permanent 5 really want to see new members enjoy the veto power by becoming permanent members. Obviously, no reform of the Security Council is going to be possible without the consent of the permanent 5. On the other hand, assuming that the reform of the Council might be possible and that Africa might have a chance to get 1 or 2 permanent seats on the Council, how would that be handled? Would it be easy to settle the matter amicably among members of the African Union? This is something which we can't postpone forever. No doubt, the issue is bound to linger, being mere theoretical. The G4 partners, which is made up of Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan, would no doubt unduly affect the balance within the Council if they were to succeed having their way. Obviously, it would be naive to expect those that are already enjoying the privilege of having permanent seat along with the veto power would be happy to see the leverage they have now be diluted. The situation we are in today makes the readiness to compromise and be flexible even more unachievable. The fact that the G4 is aiming at additional 6 permanent seats makes it obvious all 4 of its members are aiming at gaining permanent seats. The remaining 2 perhaps slated to be divided by the rest of the membership, including Africa, but they are unlikely to achieve their objectives, in my view. The hoped for reform of the Security Council is further complicated by the role of middle-sized countries who have an informal club known as the Uniting for Consensus, whose major goal is to deter the creation of additional permanent seats. It's quite a big group, among whom are Argentina, Italy, Pakistan, and the Republic of Korea. It's not very difficult to suspect which countries from among the G4 might be the preoccupation of, say, Argentina or Italy or Pakistan. All this makes it apparent that the reform of the Security Council and increasing its membership is not going to be an easy task or even practical for some time to come. It is in light of this that, in my view, without abandoning the promise of reforming the Security Council, that Africa might, in the meantime, look very seriously into how its current role in the Council could be made more effective and even more in tune with its interest. The task of carrying out this responsibility is accorded to the 3 African members of the Council, known as A3. There is little doubt, though the number is not so big, and on top of that, they don't enjoy the veto power, the A3 could nonetheless exercise enormous leverage if they carry out their activities in a well-studied, united, and responsible manner. Commitment to principles carried out in a diplomatically agile manner is, of course, critical. First of all, it's very critical to realize that the Africa group in the Security Council is not an entity which exists independent of the African Union when it's discharging its responsibilities with regard to the peace and security of the continent. The protocol relating to the establishment of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, which came into force in December 2003, having been adopted by the Assembly of the AU in 2002, makes it very clear who the higher authority is when it comes to decisions on matters of security affecting the continent. Article 2 of the protocol says the following, and I quote, "There is hereby established, pursuant to Article 5, Paragraph 2 of the Constitutive Act, a Peace and Security Council within the Union, as a standing decision-making organ for the prevention, management, and resolution of conflicts. The Peace and Security Council shall be a collective security and early warning arrangement to facilitate response to conflict and crisis situation in Africa. End of quotation. In Article 7, Paragraph 2, the same theme and principle is stressed even more clearly, and I quote, "The member states agree that in carrying out its duties under the present protocol, the Peace and Security Council acts on their behalf." Paragraph 3 of the same article says, and I quote, "The member states agree to accept and implement the decisions of the Peace and Security Council in accordance with the Constitutive Act." In paragraph 4, the same Article 7 further says, and I quote, "The member state shall extend full cooperation to and facilitate action by the Peace and Security Council." End of quotation. Obviously, one can't overlook the fact that there would be some complications with respect to how much the principles would always be carried out without fail. And this owing to the fact that partly members of the council are no doubt elected in their own personal capacity. But it shouldn't be too difficult to maintain the balance, and most of all, to respect the collective decision of the Union through the Peace and Security Council. I say all this on the basis of the experience I had as a permanent representative of Ethiopia when Ethiopia was in the Council in 2017 and 2018. I must admit, during both times, the colleagues who were in the Council with us, Egypt and Senegal in 2017, and Cote d'Ivoire and Equatorial Guinea in 2018, could not have been more cooperative and more committed to working together in line with the interest of the continent and with full respect for the guidance coming from the Peace and Security Council. While I am prepared to be contradicted, it seems to me it was when we were in the Council in 2017 and 2018 that on a number of important issues, we collectively decided that one of us speak on behalf of all of us. That has now become more or less a tradition in the Security Council. In the following years, another practice has been introduced, which should continue to be fostered as a tradition of Africa in the Council. That has to do with the A3+, which has great promise for ensuring that the interests of Africa and the like-minded could be fostered. One hopes with confidence that incoming African Council members who, starting from January, would be Algeria, Mozambique, and Sierra Leone, would strengthen the tradition more consistently with full respect for the authority of the African Union. This is going to require working in close collaboration with Guyana within the A3+ framework. One hopes talks with Guyana might have already begun or in fact concluded. No doubt, the debates in the Council are going to be very much heated in the days ahead, and the pressure on African countries are going to be intensified. This I'm saying from experience, whereby I recall when, because of the undue pressure that one of our colleagues came under, he was forced to abandon us at the last moment when he was recalled home and never to return. The whole situation was painful and tragic because though it may not have any connection with the situation that I'm recounting, our colleague did pass away around the same time. My intention is not to dig up something with the aim of embarrassing, but with the hope that we might learn from these past experiences, the better to be prepared with a view to overcome challenges that are sure to confront us. This can be taken as a foregone conclusion. Matters are going to heat up, as I said, in the Council, demanding great responsibility on the part of Africa in terms of commitment to principles. Here I must stress there is a need for a better performance on the part of both the African members of the Security Council, the A3, as well as those at headquarters. Our representatives in the Council have heavy responsibility to act in accordance with principles relating to the authority of the Peace and Security Council. These are obligations that are freely entered into. Here comes the role of the Peace and Security Council and the Commission, which have the responsibility to remind member states of their obligation because, after all, the A3 receive instructions from their respective capitals, which they cannot defy. Defiance would have grave consequences. Before I conclude, I need to stress that African diplomacy and foreign policy at the multilateral level is by no means a cakewalk. One cannot deny how much almost all African countries are vulnerable in many areas. For that matter, no country is absolutely free of some constraints. Public opinion, guided by errant elites and politicians, could wreak havoc even in those countries that are ostensibly all-powerful. There is no need to talk at length about our weaknesses, which can only be attenuated by addressing domestic weaknesses that have a way of making African countries vulnerable to pressure from outside. In the end, foreign policy starts from home. No country which is weak inside can have a strong foreign policy which is in tune with its national interest. The same logic applies at the continental level. But let us not forget also, regardless of weaknesses, it is also possible to use whatever advantages one has to lessen the damage that one would otherwise incur. For Africa, it is the unity of the people of the continent, plus those in the diaspora, that could be used in a diplomatically competent manner to foster and promote our collective interest. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Dr. Takadda Alamu, for that very enlightening intervention. I think what you just mentioned about the importance of actually addressing our domestic weaknesses is something that we should prioritize when we're thinking about adopting a strong foreign policy. I think that's something we most definitely need to reflect on further as we go into these discussions. But yeah, I think some of the very important lessons that you have also highlighted include, the importance of adherence and also commitment to the principles of the AU, also the value of collectively acting on behalf of Africa. Also adhering to this A3+ model and how we need to bring back the momentum that existed during Ethiopia's membership in the UN Security Council are some of the very important takeaways that we can emphasize from Dr. Takadda's intervention. I think it was also very interesting that you highlighted the nuances of a potential reform of the UN Security Council. What would it really look like? I think it's very important for Africa and the AU to actually think of how would we go about it without actually having our own position set. So having said that, let me hand over to Uli to also come in and maybe emphasize from your perspective on I know that your research focuses on how international organizations, shape the provision of security with a focus on the AU. So maybe from that angle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the previous contributions. Being based in Geneva, excellencies and participants, it's something you can pat yourselves on the shoulder of how close experts and diplomats interact with each other, which is something unique to Addis Ababa, and it's a pleasure to be a part of it. Thank you very much for the invitation. Excellencies, ambassadors, and participants, I'm a friend of the AU, but I'm not an African, and I speak from a role of a researcher who's very interested in partnerships of the African Union, but also where the African Union's global role is going and what the implications of that are for partnerships. As an academic, I could speak for hours, but I'll be very short. I want to address mainly two questions. The first one being a little bit more conceptual of what kind of global actor can the African Union become? And then the second one, a little bit more hands-on, and I think there's a nice complementarity to the previous contribution. What kind of opportunity is the G20 membership for the AU's overall aspirations for a global voice? So on my first question, what kind of global actor can the African Union become? From a sort of a research point of view, I think it's really interesting to distinguish on the one side representation and on the other side policy reform, really hands-on policy reform. Or to put it in a food metaphor, for example, at the G20, Africa now has a seat at the table, but it's not yet designing the menu that's being cooked, to put it in this sense, right? So African representation is one step, and the next step is African contributions to policy reforms and changes in policies. And in that regard, the two organizations that the organizers have put on the agenda for today are quite different. In terms of decision-making, the UN is a formal intergovernmental organization. The G20 uses summitry, informal collaboration also of experts. The decisions taken are formally binding on the one hand, and ideas and ideally influence over Bretton Woods institutions at the G20. And what unites them a little bit is African consensus on positions in these two organizations is hard to come by. I would say a little bit more easy to come by in the G20 than at the UN, as we've heard, very well put. And indeed, the February 23 summit reconfirmed that African Union member states are not yet ready to engage in text-based negotiations of Security Council reform. In that sense, I think, and this is not a Swiss talking point, but a Swiss initiative at the UN Security Council, and Excellency, this is interesting, the Accountability, Coherence and Transparency group that works on exactly these questions, short of membership reforms. What kind of representation can we have on the council? I'd like to note here that African membership in the ACT group is not yet universal for that matter. And that's perhaps something that one can look into without giving up, and I think you've put it very well, Excellency, without giving up on the long-term goal of actual reform. The G20 and the UN and the Security Council are united in the fact that Africa is underrepresented in both. And so these are important tendencies and important developments that we are now a part of. There's many challenges needing to be worked on, but as an AU optimist, I want to focus really on what kind of opportunity is the G20 for the AU's global aspirations a little bit more broadly. And I want to start with the campaign having been difficult, of course, but from a European perspective, the G20 is not without criticism from its citizens. And the G20 is being criticized for representing certain segments of society only, for being focused on certain interests only. And of course, it's globally unrepresentative. So for the AU to join the G20 is not only great for the AU, but it's also great for the G20. And I think this is the kind of pride and self-understanding that the African Union deserves to go into going forward into its membership. Now, going back to my distinction between representation and policy reform, both are possible at the G20, right? So you have the finance track on the one side and the Sherpa track on the other hand. The finance is extremely technical, and the AU will need experts and expertise to come up with positions and engage on very specific issues. The Sherpa track covers the entire breadth of all AUC departments. So there's a question whether that would be interesting as well, given the limited resources, of course, that the AU has. The opportunity at hand here then is really for the G20 to be a catalyst for capacity and for political will to really exercise what this means very concretely rather than talk about it in theoretical terms. What I think the AU and its partners also need to get ready is a resource-intense preparation. This morning at the AU archives, I saw the list of meetings that went into the G8 meeting in 2008, which was with Africa. And there were no less than 7 preparatory meetings on the African side, plus 3 meetings with the organizers. Just to say that the intensity of this preparatory work should not be underestimated. Another area to really act as a catalyst, I think, would be to leverage the ideas of the brightest African intellectuals and also African diaspora intellectuals. I study cyber policy a little bit as well, and there the African Union has put in place a cybersecurity expert group, which is a really good example of how the AU mobilizes the talent outside of the diplomatic community in favor of the diplomatic community, and thereby really punching above its weight given the resources that it has institutionally. And so in this sense, this really can become a fast track to making African agency concrete and tangible. I think another opportunity that the G20 presents for the African Union's aspirations in global affairs is aligning African agency of states and by the African Union. We've seen many states becoming more interested in this, many initiatives, some with a Pan-African clout, some focused more on projection of national power. And this is an extremely good thing. I think the G20 can really help the AU to kind of overcome these challenges. There will be specific positions, specific caps needing to be agreed. And with this comes fine-tuning between the institutions, between the AUC and the Assembly chairperson. The February summit was a first step in the right direction. And we've heard from Excellency that the PSC, and it's always good to go back to the legal texts, even if I'm not a lawyer, I will say this, to see the text that drives this. So to clarify kind of the triad between PSC, Assembly, and chairperson will be a very welcome step to, again, make the aspiration concrete and for it to start delivering. And then shifting to my positionality as a European researcher, I think the G20 will be an opportunity for the AU's partnerships to move towards even more politically mature relations. So the G20 could be a catalyst for and I will say it a little bit provocatively, more resilience on differences in policy matters, which is something that the AU and its partners have historically sometimes struggled with. To use a medical analogy, often Africa and the global north agree on the same diagnosis, but not on the type of medicine that should be given, right? And I think access to vaccines during COVID-19, as well as special drawing rights, were instructive in the sense that once you get to actual policy, there's a lot of learning on how to deal with substantive policy differences. And I think this would be a remarkably good thing for the AU and also for its partners to learn to deal with policy differences very constructively. So in conclusion, I think representation on the one hand, but also policy reform can and they should be mutually reinforcing. It'll be important to prioritize, right? And I think we are now in just a really incredibly exciting phase of fine-tuning the AU's aspiration for a global voice. So now's the time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Uli, for that intervention. Also, for emphasizing, the kind of global actor that Africa could be. Is it just representation, or do we take it farther from that and contribute, to policy setting in the global spectrum, and also the technical issues that come along with that? So I think we can now open the stage for discussions, further discussion and question and answer as well. As we do so, let me invite Professor Tim Muruthi, who is the head of peacebuilding intervention at the IJR, I'm sorry. So you can maybe start us off from there, yeah, it's fine.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the panelists for the really excellent contributions. Good to see my brother, Ambassador Takeda, again. This is a very timely meeting, and I wholeheartedly endorse this concept of a multilateral Pan-African foreign policy. I would even go a little bit further and say that we need to really begin to frame our approach as a Pan-African foreign policy. Pan-Africanism in this sense, I think, would be the unifying ethos, the ideological foundation of why Africa needs to continue to work towards self-determination, self-actualization, on this commitment towards a Pan-African solidarity. I think without this unifying idea, we will remain quite fragmented as a continent. We are, at the moment, very fragmented as a continent, divided, and as a people of Africa, also very divided. And we cannot escape the historical facts of slavery, both the transatlantic slave trade, also across the Indian Ocean, where these initial seeds of our fragmentation were planted with the forced removal of African bodies from the motherland. We cannot escape the historical fact of European colonialism and apartheid and its brutal effects on the mindset of African victims and survivors and their descendants, creating, I would say, an inferiority complex. The effects of colonialism also on the mindset of the European colonizers and their descendants today. And we see what's happening in the Sahel, perhaps as an example. And when the African Union was established, only 3 African states were present in their own right. Africa was not there to write the rules of multilateralism when the system was established. So I think an attitude of paternalism persisted then, and I would also argue that it continues to persist today. And this is really what we're dealing with. The paternalism that persists amongst the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council is very clear, has been articulated quite well by the panel. This is not me saying this. The optics are also quite stark. 60% of the work of the UN Security Council refers to the African continent, yet only Africa does not have a single seat amongst the UN permanent 5. It gets worse. France and the United Kingdom, which both have a population of 67 million people, are both permanent members of the UN Security Council. Africa as a whole a continent of 1.4 billion people, does not have a single seat on the UN Security Council. There was an attempt by the African countries to reform the UN Security Council. We heard from Ambassador Takeda, AU Ezulwini consensus. But I think the time, in fact, has come to move beyond the Ezulwini consensus. I think Ezulwini was stillborn. It was dead on arrival. Many would want to confine us back to Ezulwini. But I say it's clear from the failure of the United Nations Security Council, take your choice, Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, we need a new system of collective security. We need a new system to address the poly-crisis of multilateralism, climate catastrophe, so on and so forth. I think it's time to think outside the box about what the contours of a new map for the world's multilateral system would look like, and what a United Nations 2.0 would look like. The vision will not be achieved by simply moving the deck chairs around the Titanic. The Titanic, in this case, is our world and the global multiple crisis. A new line of thinking is required to activate the United Nations Charter, its own review mechanism, articulated in Article 109 of the United Nations Charter, which stipulates the provision for a general conference of the United Nations Charter. We hope, Ambassador Mona of Switzerland, that you will lead some of the countries, you and your colleagues will lead some of the countries in the UN General Assembly to map out how this can be achieved before September 2024. It's a tall ask, but there you go, you have your homework. I think it's for our survival as a planet. It's really not for Africa, and we should dispense with that notion. But African countries also have our own groundwork and homework to do. So a multilateral African foreign policy is not only urgently required, but I would say it is necessary for our survival as Africans. To revisit the Ezulwini consensus, I think is not a pathway we should be pursuing. We have a number of African Union normative documents that articulate our interests on the global stage. Agenda 2063, African Union Transitional Justice, which speaks to the need for historical redress, institutional transformation. And as I begin to conclude, I think the practical pathways to achieving this realignment, because some of our foreign policies have been captured, co-opted, and manipulated by external actors, both West and East, with the collusion of African political elites. We are not innocent, who have succeeded, I think, in not succeeded in connecting with our people, the people of Africa. So this convening, I think, is very timely by a leading African think tank, Amani Africa, partnering with the government of Namibia to get this conversation going. Our African governments, all of the embassy representatives here today, working on issues of peace and security and other global issues, need to connect with the Africa Group in New York, Geneva, also the A3 in New York, flesh out what is our Pan-African foreign policy towards the transformation of the multilateral system as we embark on UN 2.0. I think that with these few words, let me just say, our work is cut out for us. We can continue to be spectators. The planet will continue to sink. And as Africa, we will suffer the most. Thank you, Tsion.
Thank you so much, Prof, on that very profound intervention. I think I saw Abdul Qadir from the AU. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. Nice to see Ambassador Takeda and the Ambassador of Switzerland and brother from Namibia and all colleagues. And thank you, Dr. Salomon, for inviting us. So I have some issues here and there to want to raise. First of all, about mismatching words, or I don't know how to say it. Excuse my English, but it's about Africa. We sometimes say Africa and UN, and we forget that Africa is part of UN. So here we are talking about UN and AU. And because and we have this issue with regards, because I'm from the peace and security in the African Union, with regards to our access to predictable and sustainable, our UN assessed contributions, because we are not asking other people's shares only, but we are asking our shares, and we are within the principles on which the UN was built of solidarity. So we are also asking that contribution from the UN to our peace support operation. This is one of the issues. So here, what we want to say is actually is how to frame the relationship between AU and UN, and how to also promote the AU positions, because it's the AU is the institution where the position of Africa is adopted to be promoted at the international level. Second, I think Ambassador Takada talked a lot about reform of the UN Security Council, and he pleaded a lot for a permanent seats 1 or 2 for the Africa. I do not want to go to the position of the Africa or the Elizawini position, but I think what we are looking for now is a democratic council. And a democratic council cannot we cannot have a democratic council without or with the continuity of veto. The issue is not just have a permanent member or not. Do you have the veto or not? Or do we still need the veto now or not? That's the issue. So the other thing about the A3, yes, the A3, with the support of the Commission, of course, has been instrumental in like mainstreaming the AU positions within the UN Security Council. I think we also we have to owe some thanks to the Commission and Algeria also for the Oran process, because that process, which is held every year in December, it's the one which contributed to this. By the way, I'm Algerian, but I work for the AU, but I should have, I thought I should mention this one. But the most important thing is the decision that is adopted at the assembly level, where it requests all our A3 to actually promote the AU positions on matters of Africa within the UN Security Council. So there is decisions of the assembly on this matter. Now on the other issue is accountability. I put accountability. So I think the international community is accountable to Africa, because Africa now is facing global issues and global threats. This is the last one. Global threats, terrorism, climate change, and equal like financial system. So, but we own these threats, we own these challenges, and like Ambassador Takada said, we are advancing them as our weaknesses, not as victims. But this is, the international community owe some accountability to Africa. But, and the last not least, is membership to G20. So what's the value or the added value of membership within the continuity of an equal like financial system? So I think here, I'm not good at words, but I can invite everybody to watch again the words of President of Kenya to the President of France. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Abdul Qadir. So before handing over, let me just emphasize that we need to be within the time that we have set for this forum. So please shorten your interventions. Thank you. So can you set, I see one person over there.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I'm Samuel Adis from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I would like to thank the presenters, His Excellency Ambassador Tagada and Dr. Oli. My question would be on Africa's admission to the G20. And I hope you would agree with me. The emergence of these informal groups, the G8, the G20, are partly a result of disenchantment on the multilateral system. And with that, from Africa's perspective, what would be the consequence of African Union's membership to the G20? Because Africa as a continent enjoys the biggest number of member states within the UN system. So in light of that, would that may have an unintended consequence of further undermining the multilateral system, which is mainly anchored in the UN Charter and the UN system at large? So it would be very interesting to hear from Excellency Ambassador Takada and Dr. Uli on the implications of the African Union membership, because from what I am hearing from the presentation, especially from Dr. Uli, is that the African Union doesn't seem to have the institutional mechanism capacity to have greater impact in its engagement within the G20. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we can just take a couple of more questions and then I'll hand over to the panel.
Thank you very much. My name is Ambassador Alain Nyamitwe. I am not the other Nyamitwe, but I'm the original one. I want to thank the speakers for the very relevant talking points that they have shared. And I concur with many of the things which were said, because as a former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Burundi, I have experienced a number of things that were said. And but Takeda, whom I met, I'm sure, in New York, in the course of the term that Ethiopia had in the UN Security Council. Yes, numbers are very important, but there's even more important. I hear African diplomats talking about UN reform, UN Security Council reform, and generally the thinking is about numbers. How many member states should be represented in the UN Security Council is the most common question. But I believe that the most important issue here is effectiveness. We could have 10, but with no importance whatsoever. But we could have 2 or 3 with strength and capacity to turn things over. So that's number one. So again, on the Israeli consensus, the question here is not about African common positions. The question is how our common positions are being, I do not want to use the word manipulated, but being swayed in one way or another by foreign forces. And when I say foreign forces, I'm not talking about the South versus North. Virtually every actor outside Africa wants to have a say on the Israeli consensus, which means that actually, after so many years, it is about time that we as Africans, we rethought that consensus to give it more weight and actually to make it more relevant to the current conditions and to the current world. G20, again, a very good example of how sometimes we are very happy about news of how Africa integrates groupings, etc. But it shouldn't be looked at as a gift. We should, as Africans, again, sit and strategize more about our participation in G20. what is it that we're going to contribute to that grouping? What are we going to collect as to collect as benefits for our countries in the continent? Number 3 and last, I would want to hear your thoughts on, and again, thank you, Dr. Takeda, on the statement you made that once, the weakness of a country is in correlation with this foreign policy. If a country is weak, its foreign policy will be weak as well. And there are so many weaknesses, fragmentations that we can see in our countries which impact our foreign policies. Now, one question that keeps coming to my mind is the role of regional bodies or regional mechanisms in Africa in shaping peace and security. In fact, the situations that we are facing on the continent are somehow an illustration that some mechanisms are either no more relevant or are weak or need to be invigorated in order to indeed speak to those situations in a more concrete manner and go beyond the traditional and classical thinking that we've been following for the last 20 plus years since the inception of the Peace and Security Council. I submit. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for these questions. I think there was someone, it was mentioned to me that someone from around the middle raised their hands first. Okay, I think Ambassador of France is the one I saw immediately.
Thank you very much. For sake of time, and with my apologies to my French-speaking colleague, I speak in English. I have 3 points to make. The first one on the reform of the existing system. So there are 2 points. Lots have been said about the reform of the UN Security Council. What you can notice is that officially, in their old statement made in different forums, so the P5 expressed support to the reform. Now we have good reason to question the sincerity of some of the P5 representatives. And I would say that for African Union, African Group, it's maybe time to call the bluff. So I'll be clear. I already had this discussion with some of you. We must learn from the precedent, the only one previous reform of the UN Security Council in 1963. So this reform happened without a consensus. So there's no need for a consensus to move towards a reform. And the reform was adopted by the UN General Assembly with a majority of 2/3. And this is very important to keep in mind because the Africa Group alone represent 28% of the UNGA and has some potential allies. So the G4 expressed support to Ezulwini. Now we don't know the position of the AU regarding the G4, but there is room to create alliance. And I don't think that politically speaking, any of the P5 member can block the reform because there is no veto on the UNGA resolution. The veto can only be used de facto with the reform of the charter. And I think the political cost of any veto of any of the P5 member would be too high to block the reform. So my advice to my African colleagues, it's time to call the bluff, and it's time to start working on the text-based resolution. That's the first point.
Thank you.
Maybe.
I'm sorry, we're really stressed for time. That's why I'm cutting people really short. Okay. I really apologize. We can also talk about this during coffee and engage a little bit further. I think Jide over there was among the people that was raising their hand. So Jide, please.
Thank you very much for the very good presentations. I think that we are clear that there's an unequal relationship. But for the last 15 years, and I see Ambassador Fred here, we've been helping shape the common African position through the African Union and made inputs to several UN Security Council resolutions. Usually it's sent to the AU Commission when it's in blue draft, right? which means we hardly are able to even make any significant or radical change to such resolution. And it seems to me that we focus too much on the politics of representation, and as a result, denied ourselves what is probably more fundamental, which is how do we restructure our economies so that we can become more influential? You know, you talked about Britain, the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is a $2 trillion economy, right? The US is a $22 trillion economy. And the whole of Africa is just $1.2 trillion. Could we consider just investing in the economics of our own transformation in such a way that will become influential? And I know it's not mutually exclusive, but it's time that we focus on economic transformation and less on this conversation around the politics of representation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jide. I'll just take one more question from the gentleman over there. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Eon, for the opportunity. I'm Tasfai, from PCN Secretary Advisor from OPAD. Firstly, I would like to thank the conveners of this high-level panel discussion. I have 2 questions. I will try to be fast. The first one is forwarded to any of the panelists. So Africa has been historically struggling to secure equal representation in the international system, starting from the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, even in the formation of the UN Security Council, let alone a permanent seat. It didn't even have a proper non-permanent seat until the mid-1960s. So how can it position itself as a key player in shaping the emerging multipolar world order, even with the global shift of power with the emergence of the BRICS, given with its previous missed opportunities in global economic governance and global security governance, and to present as a fundamental block of the future world order. So my second question is forwarded to His Excellency Ambassador Dr. Takada Alamu. Among others, I heard His Excellency stating the S3 is not independent of the African Union. Be that as it may, there are some countries in the S3 that are said to be aligning themselves with their alliance in the Security Council, be it for exchange for aid or for their political interests. So there are some examples, but for the sake of time, the one that always strikes me in my mind is in March 17, 2011, when the UN Security Council was drafting or approving the resolution 1973 on the issue of no-fly zone over Libya, which is sometimes termed as NATO resolution on Libya. All of the African countries, or the S3s, voted in favor of this resolution. All of them, Nigeria, Gabon, and South Africa. So, which is deviating from the main principle of African solution for African problems, and also sidelining the African Union. So with this in mind, what lessons can be learned and what mechanisms can be established to promote greater unity and coherence among the African representatives in the UN Security Council? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. So let me just hand over to our panelists to address the questions that were forwarded to you. Maybe Dr. Oli, you can start off with the question relating to the G20.
Thank you very much. I wouldn't like to come across as a defense attorney for the G20, to be perfectly sure. But I'm happy to provide some insights on what the AU stands to gain and what the G20 stands to gain from this membership, I think, and that's important. I think really important to note that this is an informal organization, a policy community that generates ideas, and these ideas then travel in other parts of the multilateral system. The G20 has been particularly good at this. The G7 is much more a grouping of the most powerful economies, and the G20 really has this knowledge creating and knowledge circulating role. And I think that's where you can call it Afri-capitalism or Africa's Pan-African economic transformation. Those are the ideas that can be infused in there. And then the second really important informal role that the G20 does have is stabilizing the global economy in terms of crisis. The G20 is bad at several things, but the coordination in the 2008 financial crisis is one of the things that are quite universally accepted as being something useful. And again, Africa would have gained from being part of that conversation, I think. Then concretely, and I like these questions that His Excellency Samuel asked on the coordination and the institutional mechanisms, it's just that the mechanisms are not there yet. That's not a problem per se, I think. I would say, and since there are member state delegations in the room, there's an interest for the AUC to have the necessary resources to act as a permanent secretariat role for the G20, whereas the assembly chair, of course, also will have a role. But there's an interest in that. And if those resources don't come from member states, we know where they might come from elsewhere. And I think this is an area where member states want to put their money where their mouth is on African agency. And then, again, PSC questions on whether the PSC is interested in issues affecting the African continent only, or whether there are global issues that affect the African continent. And I just want to double down on a point made by my friend Jide, which is really important, that this economic empowerment leading to more power eventually, I think they're fully compatible. As you said yourself, the issues discussed at the G20, such as the reform of the Bretton Woods system, is intrinsically linked to how cheap is it to get money for infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So these are topics that are working at very different levels, but push exactly in the same direction. So excellent point. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Uli, for that brief response. Maybe I could prioritize Mr. Rodney or Ambassador Petro, because I know that you're also constrained for time. If you would like to respond to any of the questions, maybe around the role of regional bodies in Africa, or how common positions are being swayed outside of Africa and how to address this, or...
Thank you very much. And it's indeed a fascinating discussion. I kept my welcoming remarks more generic around the notion of trust. And I still believe that this notion should guide us also moving forward, because what we do here suffer is a lack of trust. But this is something very generic. So let me try to be a little bit more concrete on certain positions. I appreciate the clarity and the profoundness of Professor Maurice's input. And indeed, historically, these are elements that have to be taken into account. Only 3 countries in San Francisco when the charter was negotiated. I dare to push back a little bit, if I may. After colonialism, where the UN played an important role in assisting the decolonization of Africa, I think every country then, as a sovereign decision, decided to join the UN and subscribe to the UN Charter. Many of the instruments that follow, particularly also when it comes to the human rights architecture, the 2 pacts, for example, and so on, were also negotiated, again, sometimes overlapping with decolonialization. But I think what we've seen is that Africa has demonstrated the willingness to be part of the UN system and has subscribed to the multifaceted instruments that the UN system has come up with. And in fact, by and large, I think particularly if we stay on the discussion around human rights, I think Africa and the African Union and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights has much more visionary instruments. As an example, the Kampala Convention on the Human Rights of IDPs is something that we as an international community did not yet manage to assemble around the consensus, where Africa has a very strong document on the protection of IDPs. What I'm trying to say is that we have to look at all the elements. I think that there is this element of the brutal past of slavery and colonialism that has impacted the way that Africa has been perceived. I think much of the world's history has been completely written oblivious of the critical role that Africa has played. But on the other hand, and it was mentioned, Africa has 54 votes in the UN General Assembly, more than 1/4. You are an incredible strong element also within the G77 with the Global South. So I think the instruments are there to step forward and as you have done, I'm not saying that it has never been done, but to pick up also the point made by the Ambassador of France, the UN Security Council reform is not something that is being discussed within the 15. It's discussed within the General Assembly. But my point there would rather be, and picking up something that was also mentioned in the room, is it really just about numbers? Or is it more about an honest discussion, what we would like to see the Council to be in the future? Is it in the interest of the world, and thereby also in the interest of Africa, to add more veto powers to the Council? So our position as Switzerland is very clear. We acknowledge and we would be on your side in reforming the Council when it comes to a better representation for Africa, but we have a long-standing doubt on increasing the numbers of veto powers because we work towards, and Willy Steiger mentioned it, a more accountable, a more coherent, and more transparent Security Council. So ideally, the discussion moving forward on the Council is not only about more seats for these countries or that region, but is about what do we want the Council to be. And I know that when I talk about the P5, the differences are staggering. France, for example, but you correct me, Rémi, I think your country has not used the veto in over 25 years, or even more. I think overall, you may used it about 16 times. Almost half of the time the veto was used by one P5 member. So I think this is not a very numeric discussion. It's more about a systemic discussion. And this leads us back again to the question of trust, of solidarity, and universality. Where do we want to move together ahead towards a more just, more accountable, more transparent, more inclusive multilateral system in the Security Council, but broadly speaking also in all multilateral instruments, including the IFIs, where Switzerland as well has signaled that we are ready to engage in discussion on reforming also the Bretton Woods institutions. And finally, also on UNSS contributions, our position was very clear. We were one of the co-sponsors of the resolution presented by Ethiopia back in 2018, because we were steadfast of the opinion, and we still are, that what the African Union and the African countries are contributing is a contribution to a common global good. And therefore, there has to be an arrangement where this is also taken into consideration. But again, let's not stop our discussion on numbers, on funding. Let's continue the discussion as enshrined, as presented also in the new agenda for peace by the Secretary General, about preventive actions, about sustaining peace, about reforming also our understanding on how we work together so that the question of peace enforcement is part of it, but not the sole focus of our discussion moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency.
Thank you very much. In the few closing remarks that I may have I'll speak Namibia as a member of the C10 on the UN Security Council reform. I believe that it's time that we relook the reform of the C10, because we meet every year to discuss the common position of Africa with regard to the UN Security Council reform. But these positions seems to get uncommon every year. So I really believe, or as Namibia believe, that we need to relook the position of the C10, because they've been there for a long time. Should we change our strategy? Should we look at our own composition, even though it's regionally? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to both of our panelists for those reflections. So, Ambassador Takeda, I think there were questions specifically addressed to you. So let me hand over.
Good. Thank you, Sion. Let me go back to Professor Moretti. Um, while I agree almost with everything you said, having been in diplomacy for so long, even though I began as a teacher, I used to be a professor like you, but I stayed in diplomacy for too long, therefore I have a tendency to be very practical. And because of that, really, as I said, while I have a lot of sympathy for your position, and it's very difficult to debunk what you said, as a level of theory. Really, when you come down to the practical challenge we face, really, you have to look at those matters in a pragmatic manner, really. While I am, as I said, I have a lot of sympathy for what you said in connection with colonialism and all that, and I do understand the damage that was done to us by that experience. But then when you come at the present time, I tend to focus on what we need to do, the individual African countries, internally. It's very easy to see, the deficit that you see in governance. How would you really continue to criticize? I mean, criticizing is justified, but on the other hand, you need to overcome the challenge that you are facing in your individual countries. Unless you do that, you will be unlikely to address the challenge that you are facing. That's why I said in my presentation that foreign policy begins at home. Now, Abdul Qadir, really, I mean, you have your country is going to have a major challenge when you take up your seat in the Security Council come January. Major challenge, really. We haven't discussed that in this meeting, even though I had the opportunity to sort of tacitly refer to that challenge. There is a lot of problems that are going to haunt us very soon in the Security Council. Those members of the Security Council, including Switzerland, which is now a member of the Council and will continue to be next year as well, starting January. One can anticipate the kind of challenge that members of the Council are going to face. It's not very difficult to anticipate what challenge one is going to encounter come January or even now. Therefore, really, I will say to Abdul Qadir, while I agree with you, what you said, but at the same time, in Algeria, I mean, there's a need to make the necessary preparation for January. My colleague from the Foreign Ministry said, I don't know whether the last one, I didn't get the name, but who talked about African solutions to African problems. I agree with that. That is, the mantra we have, no doubt. But on the other hand, principle has to go along with it. Unity of African countries on the Security Council, that is going to be very critical, yes. But at the same time, it should be based on principles that we stand for within the AU. I attach extremely great importance to that. A friend cited a at the end. He said, in fact, the other extreme of basically Professor Moretti. He said, it's not really that important to talk about representation. We should focus on economic issues. That's absolutely right. But on the other hand, one should not overlook the value of focusing on political issues as well. Unless you sort out your problems in the security area, in the political area, how are you going to ensure that your economic programs will succeed? I have no reason really to quarrel with you on what you said, but you should not overlook the fact that the political area is also very critical. Unless you sort out those, you are unlikely to make progress in your economic endeavors. This is what I have to say, really.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Takada. So I will thank our panelists very much for their contributions, and also everyone who has joined us here, as well as virtually, for your participation and for being with us as we discuss this very important topic. I also want to really apologize for cutting people short. It's because we have another event following this. Having said that, I will hand over to our founding director, Dr. Salamon Derso, to do our closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zion, for excellent moderation. I would like to also extend my deep appreciation to the embassies of Switzerland and Namibia for their excellent partnership in not just the convening of this particular excellent event, but also generally with respect to the entire work that we do at Amani Africa. Switzerland has been a founding partner for Amani Africa. We are grateful for that. And we have been working, as my brother Rodney pointed out, with Namibia since February on a high-level panel on Africa and the reform of multilateralism with Namibia. The excellent expertise of African diplomats, policy actors, as well as scholars to bear on the thinking of African Union member states as they articulate their positions, including, for example, with respect to, as Rodney mentioned, the Summit of the Future, which had the ambition to also acknowledge Professor Moretti, the ambition, as the Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, mentioned, to have UN 2.0, which to which you made reference, and indeed this is a very opportune moment, whether you look at it from the perspective of the membership of the African Union in the G20, or from the perspective of the raging debate and discourse championed by the Secretary General about the reform of the multilateral system writ large, not just as it relates to peace and security, anchored on debates around the reform of the Security Council, but also on the reform of the financial system, on also addressing new and emerging issues in order to save the planet and indeed its people from the tectonic intersecting polycrisis that we all are confronted with, and indeed we are experiencing with an enormous toll on the lives and livelihoods of people, whether it is in the context of conflict or in the context of climate-induced extreme weather conditions. I am also deeply, deeply grateful for each and every one of you present here, for honoring us with your presence and for gracing this occasion, both with your presence but also with your participation. We are forever grateful. We continue to count on your active participation as we continue to play our part of the role in facilitating convenings like this one, but also in policy research and analysis that contributes to the very rich debate and discussion, as well as the formulation of policies within the framework of the African Union. There are certain themes, as you heard, that runs through this, the interventions from the members of the panel. There are some issues relating to, for example, principles, what I call principles, right? Which are, if you like, the bedrock that shape and inform whatever discussion that happens, whether it is from the perspective of questions relating to, for example, what Ambassador Mona said about trust, and indeed the fundamental importance of respect for the UN Charter and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. These are very fundamental. Dr. Takada, in sharing his rich experience, including as a PR of elected member of the UN Security Council, he also underscored the importance of certain fundamental principles as it relates to the role of the Africa's 3 members of the UN Security Council. Namely, for example, the imperative to work within the parameters of the terms defined in the Peace and Security Council protocol, and also the need for anchoring the engagement of the A3 in, of course, on the common positions taken within the framework of the African Union, and therefore reinforcing through the collective action of the A3 the authority of the AU, which amplifies Africa's agency in global governance, which is also critical. And Rodney, in his remark, also highlighted how urgent the need for reform is, both not just from a historical perspective, of which all the members of the panel made reference, as well as it was at the core of Prof. Tim's intervention, but also, importantly, from the fact that the system as it stands is not in sync with the current realities of the world. And this creates, obviously, a legitimacy crisis for the system. And that legitimacy crisis is a very dangerous one. It is a very dangerous one because in the agenda, in the new agenda for peace, actually, the Secretary General couldn't have been much more stark in saying that we are at a grave risk of complete lawlessness in the world. I don't think that we are at a grave risk. I think we are living, we are experiencing what that looks like from events that are unfolding, whether it is Russia, Ukraine, as mentioned, or now Palestine and Israel. So the need for reform couldn't have been much more urgent if we add to these lists the issues relating to climate change, the issues relating to the cost of living crisis that many are facing, the reversals that we are experiencing in the journey towards meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. We are going backward, as the assessment have revealed in the course of the last General Assembly. So principles, very, very important. And the questions have been asked, with respect to, for example, what should we do about our weaknesses as the continent, as Africa? Where should our priority be? Should it be about transforming our economy? Or should it be about working for more representation, more active engagement and role and voice for Africa in the international arena? I'm not really sure if we have to put these in either or terms. Because if we are going to put them in either or terms, then that would condemn the continent to a permanent position of not aspiring for and indeed getting justice for the injustices that many people have articulated. Yes, we have to work for and work hard at that for getting our house in order. But being and exercising agency in global decision making doesn't depend on you having your house in order. Otherwise, what that means is basically until that time, you wouldn't be able to participate in decisions that would affect you. And that is not how the international system works. And therefore, very important. Specific areas of reform have also been raised relating to the Security Council. Ambassador Remy drew our attention that there is experience, which actually speaks to Professor Tim's point with respect to Article 109 of the UN Charter, which is basically there is a position that says that there has to be a consensus, but Ambassador Remy pointed out that actually there is a precedent that doesn't require consensus, that can simply depend on the General Assembly and work that is done within the General Assembly. And questions have been asked whether or not we should continue with respect to Africa's position, for example. Of course, what does Africa's common position, the Islamic consensus, tell us about Africa adopting foreign policy on multilateral issues? I think it is an example that we can draw on, the fact that there is a common position, right? But there is a possibility for also revisiting that common position as circumstances and conditions change. How do we go about achieving that? But Ambassador Takadari warned us one thing. The process for reform of the UN Security Council wouldn't be easy. So while we are aiming for that, we have to also get some things done short of the reform of the UN Security Council. What are those things that we need to get right short of the UN Security Council reform? These relate to working methods issues of the UN Security Council, including questions relating to pen holding, who are the members of the Council who hold the pen and therefore draft decisions of the UN Security Council on matters that concern the continent, on issues relating to making sure that the A3 actually continue and institutionalize the tradition that Ambassador Takada made reference to, of speaking as one. And of course, the possibility also of building on the A+ tradition, and therefore working with other elected members of the Security Council in, for example, presenting one statement on behalf of the A3+. Guyana, as Ambassador Takada mentioned, could be a potential for this. I think there are other issues that have been raised in relation to other reform processes, particularly Uli's intervention was actually focusing specifically on the G20 and the opportunities that come with it, but also what kind of preparations are required. What kind of structures, for example, do you need to have in place for the African Union Commission to play the role of being the secretariat for African Union's membership in the G20? What kind of structure do you need to put in place, for example, with respect to the negotiation of common positions with respect to the agenda items on the G20? What role do member states play? Do you need to have, for example, a permanent representatives committee, subcommittee dealing with G20 issues? And of course, how do you make sure, as the representative from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Samuel mentioned, how do you make sure that your engagement in the G20 would not be at the expense of reinforcing the role of the UN as the body, the most democratic, the most representative body in the world, the body that has the responsibility for the well-being of all of humanity, as it were. Questions that have been asked highlight also another, I think, point that I would like to highlight is what should be the role of Pan-Africanism, what should be the role of history. And I will end with this point. There is the question of principle. But does the multilateral system operate exclusively on the basis of principle? How about power? What place do we give to power? I think we have to marry the question of principles with that of how power works, without us understanding that power plays an enormous role in shaping what kind of outcomes decision-making processes would lead to. It would be difficult to really achieve a realistic African foreign policy on multilateral processes. So the formation of African foreign policy on multilateral processes has to be informed by, obviously, the interest and well-being of the people of the continent, the historical experience of the continent, the principles on which the UN system is founded, and by a very hard-nosed recognition and appreciation that power also plays an enormous role in shaping international processes. That is why, for example, in engaging in the G20 process, it would be naive to expect that, as Ambassador Takada rightly pointed out, that it would be an easy walk, the engagement and the membership. And Uli reminded us, you know, we partners and African countries agree on the diagnosis of the problem, but on the prescription of the medicine, they often go in different directions. On the diagnosis, I agree, because when it comes to diagnosis, I think the principles can play a very important role. But on the prescription of the medicine, it's not the principles that matter the most. It is power. And when it comes to that, Africa can really mobilize not much. But as Ambassador Takada also reminded us, if we use our positions strategically with the common voice and reinforcing the authority of the African Union, and therefore the 54 members of the UN from Africa, then there is a possibility of translating that into leverage that can move power into acting in a way that also actually caters for not just the well-being and the interests of the powerful, but also for those that make up the human family. And ultimately, I think the point about Africa's foreign policy should not just about advancing the interests and considerations of Africa and its people, but also about advancing global public goods, as rightly pointed out. Because there are issues that tie all of us together as members of the human family. And those issues are beyond the capacity and beyond the possibilities of any single region of the world, and indeed beyond the capacities of even the most powerful. That is why Africa's contribution and agency and role in multilateral foreign policy becomes critical to contribute to that, to the resolution of those common challenges and also to the creation of the common good for all of us. I would like to stop here and only conclude by thanking the funding partners of Amani Africa. Switzerland here, represented by Ambassador Mona. We have Ireland. I'm not sure if we have any representative at this point in time. Norway, we have strongly represented here. I'm not sure if we have Open Society Foundation, to whom I would like to express our deep appreciation for their continued partnership and support for the work that we do, and we count on their continued support. Last but not least, member states of the African Union. Thank you very much for your continued trust and partnership. And my colleagues and friends in the African Union, thank you always. And UNOAU, ICRC, and many others who are here and who are not here. Thank you for your partnership, and I wish you all the best. Yes, Ambassador of Kazakhstan is here as well. Ambassador of Italy here. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Please, can you join me in clapping for my colleagues, please? Tseon here. Tafsahat, Yaruk, Robel, Sisai, Preven as well. Thank you all very much again.